Part 5, Chapter 4, Section 1 of Crime and Punishment by Fyodor Dostoyevsky. Translated by Constance Garnett. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine. Part 5, Chapter 4, Section 1. Raskolnikov had been a vigorous and active champion of Sonia against Luzhin, although he had such a load of horror and anguish in his own heart. But having gone through so much in the morning, he found a sort of relief in a change of sensations, apart from the strong personal feeling which impelled him to defend Sonia. He was agitated too, especially at some moments, by the thought of his approaching interview with Sonia. He had to tell her who had killed Lizaveta. He knew the terrible suffering it would be to him, and, as it were, brushed away the thought of it. So when he cried as he left Katerina Ivanovna's, "Well, Sofya Semyonovna, we shall see what you'll say now," he was still superficially excited, still vigorous and defiant from his triumph over Luzhin. But strange to say, by the time he reached Sonia's lodging, he felt a sudden impotence and fear. He stood still in hesitation at the door, asking himself the strange question, must he tell her who killed Lizaveta? It was a strange question, because he felt at the very time not only that he could not help telling her, but also that he could not put off the telling. He did not yet know why it must be so, he only felt it, and the agonizing sense of his impotence before the inevitable almost crushed him. To cut short his hesitation and suffering, he quickly opened the door and looked at Sonia from the doorway. She was sitting with her elbows on the table and her face in her hands, but seeing Raskolnikov she got up at once and came to meet him as though she were expecting him. "What would have become of me but for you?" she said quickly, meeting him in the middle of the room. Evidently she was in haste to say this to him. It was what she had been waiting for. Raskolnikov went to the table and sat down on the chair from which she had only just risen. She stood facing him 2 steps away, just as she had done the day before. "Well, Sonia," he said, and felt that his voice was trembling. "It was all due to your social position and the habits associated with it. Did you understand that just now?" Her face showed her distress. "Only don't talk to me as you did yesterday," she interrupted him. "Please don't begin it. There is misery enough without that." She made haste to smile, afraid that he might not like the reproach. "I was silly to come away from there. What is happening there now? I wanted to go back directly, but I kept thinking that you would come." He told her that Amalia Ivanovna was turning them out of their lodging, and that Katerina Ivanovna had run off somewhere to seek justice. "My God!" cried Sonia, "let's go at once!" And she snatched up her cape. "It's everlastingly the same thing," said Raskolnikov irritably. "You've no thought except for them. Stay a little with me." "But Katerina Ivanovna?" "You won't lose Katerina Ivanovna, you may be sure. She'll come to you herself since she has run out," he added peevishly. "If she doesn't find you here, you'll be blamed for it." Sonia sat down in painful suspense. Raskolnikov was silent, gazing at the floor and deliberating. "This time Luzhin did not want to prosecute you," he began, not looking at Sonia. "But if he had wanted to, if it had suited his plans, he would have sent you to prison if it had not been for Lebeziatnikov and me. Ah?" "Yes," she assented in a faint voice. "Yes," she repeated, preoccupied and distressed. "But I might easily not have been there. And it was quite an accident, Lebeziatnikov's turning up." Sonia was silent. "And if you'd gone to prison, what then? Do you remember what I said yesterday?" Again she did not answer. He waited. "I thought you would cry out again, 'Don't speak of it, leave off!'" Raskolnikov gave a laugh, but rather a forced one. "What, silence again?" he asked a minute later. "We must talk about something, you know. It would be interesting for me to know how you would decide a certain 'problem,' as Lebeziatnikov would say." He was beginning to lose the thread. "No, really, I am serious. Imagine, Sonia, that you had known all Luzhin's intentions beforehand. Known, that is, for a fact, that they would be the ruin of Katerina Ivanovna and the children and yourself thrown in, since you don't count yourself for anything. Polenka too, for she'll go the same way. Well, if suddenly it all depended on your decision whether he or they should go on living, that is, whether Luzhin should go on living and doing wicked things, or Katerina Ivanovna should die. How would you decide which of them was to die? I ask you." Sonia looked uneasily at him. There was something peculiar in this hesitating question, which seemed approaching something in a roundabout way. "I felt that you were going to ask some question like that," she said, looking inquisitively at him. "I daresay you did. But how is it to be answered?" "Why do you ask about what could not happen?" said Sonia reluctantly. "Then it would be better for Luzhin to go on living and doing wicked things? You haven't dared to decide even that." "But I can't know the divine providence. And why do you ask what can't be answered? What's the use of such foolish questions? How could it happen that it should depend on my decision? Who has made me a judge to decide who is to live and who is not to live?" "Oh, if the divine providence is to be mixed up in it, there's no doing anything," Raskolnikov grumbled morosely. "You'd better say straight out what you want," Sonia cried in distress. "You are leading up to something again. Can you have come simply to torture me?" She could not control herself and began crying bitterly. He looked at her in gloomy misery. 5 minutes passed. "Of course, you're right, Sonia," he said softly at last. He was suddenly changed. His tone of assumed arrogance and helpless defiance was gone. Even his voice was suddenly weak. "I told you yesterday that I was not coming to ask forgiveness, and almost the first thing I've said is to ask forgiveness. I said that about Luzhin and Providence for my own sake. I was asking forgiveness, Sonia." He tried to smile, but there was something helpless and incomplete in his pale smile. He bowed his head and hid his face in his hands. And suddenly a strange, surprising sensation of a sort of bitter hatred for Sonia passed through his heart. As it were wondering and frightened of this sensation, he raised his head and looked intently at her. But he met her uneasy and painfully anxious eyes fixed on him. There was love in them. His hatred vanished like a phantom. It was not the real feeling, he had taken the one feeling for the other. It only meant that that minute had come. He hid his face in his hands again and bowed his head. Suddenly he turned pale, got up from his chair, looked at Sonia, and without uttering a word sat down mechanically on her bed. His sensations that moment were terribly like the moment when he had stood over the old woman with the axe in his hand, and felt that he must not lose another minute. "What's the matter?" asked Sonia, dreadfully frightened. He could not utter a word. This was not at all the way he had intended to tell, and he did not understand what was happening to him now. She went up to him softly, sat down on the bed beside him and waited, not taking her eyes off him. Her heart throbbed and sank. It was unendurable. He turned his deadly pale face to her. His lips worked, helplessly struggling to utter something. A pang of terror passed through Sonia's heart. "What's the matter?" she repeated, drawing a little away from him. "Nothing, Sonia, don't be frightened, it's nonsense. It really is nonsense if you think of it," he muttered like a man in delirium. "Why have I come to torture you?" he added suddenly, looking at her. "Why, really? I keep asking myself that question, Sonia." He had perhaps been asking himself that question a quarter of an hour before, but now he spoke helplessly, hardly knowing what he said and feeling a continual tremor all over. "Oh, how you are suffering!" she muttered in distress, looking intently at him. "It's all nonsense. Listen, Sonia," he suddenly smiled, a pale, helpless smile for 2 seconds. "You remember what I meant to tell you yesterday?" Sonia waited uneasily. "I said as I went away that perhaps I was saying good bye for ever, but that if I came to day, I would tell you who killed Lizaveta." She began trembling all over. "Well, here I've come to tell you." "Then you really meant it yesterday?" she whispered with difficulty. "How do you know?" she asked quickly, as though suddenly regaining her reason. Sonia's face grew paler and paler and she breathed painfully. "I know." She paused a minute. "Have they found him?" she asked timidly. "No." "Then how do you know about it?" she asked again, hardly audibly and again after a minute's pause. He turned to her and looked very intently at her. "Guess," he said, with the same distorted helpless smile. A shudder passed over her. "But you... why do you frighten me like this?" she said, smiling like a child. "I must be a great friend of his, since I know," Raskolnikov went on, still gazing into her face, as though he could not turn his eyes away. "He did not mean to kill that Lizaveta. He killed her accidentally. He meant to kill the old woman when she was alone, and he went there, and then Lizaveta came in. He killed her too." Another awful moment passed. Both still gazed at one another. "You can't guess then?" he asked suddenly, feeling as though he were flinging himself down from a steeple. "No," whispered Sonia. "Take a good look." As soon as he had said this again, the same familiar sensation froze his heart. He looked at her, and all at once seemed to see in her face the face of Lizaveta. He remembered clearly the expression in Lizaveta's face when he approached her with the axe and she stepped back to the wall, putting out her hand with childish terror in her face, looking as little children do when they begin to be frightened of something, looking intently and uneasily at what frightens them, shrinking back and holding out their little hands on the point of crying. Almost the same thing happened now to Sonia. With the same helplessness and the same terror, she looked at him for a while and suddenly putting out her left hand, pressed her fingers faintly against his breast, and slowly began to get up from the bed, moving further from him and keeping her eyes fixed even more immovably on him. Her terror infected him. The same fear showed itself on his face. In the same way he stared at her and almost with the same childish smile. "Have you guessed?" he whispered at last. "Good God!" broke in an awful wail from her bosom. She sank helplessly on the bed with her face in the pillows, but a moment later she got up, moved quickly to him, seized both his hands, and gripping them tight in her thin fingers, began looking into his face again with the same intent stare. In this last desperate look she tried to look into him and catch some last hope. But there was no hope, there was no doubt remaining, it was all true. Later on, indeed, when she recalled that moment, she thought it strange, and wondered why she had seen at once that there was no doubt. She could not have said, for instance, that she had foreseen something of the sort, and yet now, as soon as he told her, she suddenly fancied that she had really foreseen this very thing. "Stop, Sonia, enough! Don't torture me," he begged her miserably. It was not at all like this he had thought of telling her, but this is how it happened. She jumped up, seeming not to know what she was doing, and wringing her hands, walked into the middle of the room, but quickly went back and sat down again beside him, her shoulder almost touching his. All of a sudden she started as though she had been stabbed, uttered a cry and fell on her knees before him, she did not know why. "What have you done? What have you done to yourself?" she said in despair, and jumping up she flung herself on his neck, threw her arms round him and held him tightly. Raskolnikov drew back and looked at her with a mournful smile. "You are a strange girl, Sonia. You kiss me and hug me when I tell you about that. You don't think what you are doing." "There is no one in the whole world now so unhappy as you," she cried in a frenzy, not hearing what he said, and she suddenly broke into violent hysterical weeping. A feeling long unfamiliar to him flooded his heart and softened it at once. He did not struggle against it. 2 tears started into his eyes and hung on his eyelashes. "Then you won't leave me, Sonia?" he said, looking at her almost with hope. "No, no, never, nowhere!" cried Sonia. "I will follow you. I will follow you everywhere. Oh, my God! Oh, how miserable I am! Why didn't I know you before? Why didn't you come before? Oh, dear!" "Here I have come." "Yes, now. What's to be done now? Together, together," she repeated, as it were unconsciously, and she hugged him again. "I'll follow you to Siberia." He recoiled at this, and the same hostile, almost haughty smile came to his lips. "Perhaps I don't want to go to Siberia yet, Sonia," he said. Sonia looked at him quickly. Again, after her first passionate, agonizing sympathy for the unhappy man, the terrible idea of the murder overwhelmed her. In his changed tone she seemed to hear the murderer speaking. She looked at him bewildered. She knew nothing as yet, why, how, with what object it had been. Now all these questions rushed at once into her mind, and again she could not believe it. He is a murderer? Could it be true? "What's the meaning of it? Where am I?" she said in complete bewilderment, as though still unable to recover herself. "How could you? You, a man like you! How could you bring yourself to it? What does it mean?" "Oh, well, to plunder. Leave off, Sonia," he answered wearily, almost with vexation. Sonia stood as though struck dumb, but suddenly she cried: "You were hungry? It was... to help your mother? Yes?" "No, Sonia, no," he muttered, turning away and hanging his head. "I was not so hungry. I certainly did want to help my mother, but that's not the real thing either. Don't torture me, Sonia." Sonia clasped her hands. Could it all be true? Good God, what a truth! Who could believe it? And how could you give away your last farthing and yet rob and murder? Ah!" she cried suddenly. "That money you gave Katerina Ivanovna, that money! Can that money..." "No, Sonia," he broke in hurriedly, "that money was not it. Don't worry yourself. That money my mother sent me and it came when I was ill, the day I gave it to you. Razumihin saw it, he received it for me. That money was mine, my own." Sonia listened to him in bewilderment and did her utmost to comprehend. "And that money... I don't even know really whether there was any money," he added softly, as though reflecting. "I took a purse off her neck, made of chamois leather, a purse stuffed full of something. But I didn't look in it, I suppose I hadn't time. And the things, chains and trinkets, I buried under a stone with the purse, next morning, in a yard off the V Prospect. They are all there now." Sonia strained every nerve to listen. "Then why you said you did it to rob, but you took nothing?" she asked quickly, catching at a straw. "I don't know. I haven't yet decided whether to take that money or not," he said, musing again, and seeming to wake up with a start, he gave a brief ironical smile. "Ach, what silly stuff I am talking, eh?" The thought flashed through Sonia's mind: wasn't he mad? But she dismissed it at once. No, it was something else. She could make nothing of it, nothing. "Do you know, Sonia," he said suddenly with conviction, "let me tell you, if I'd simply killed because I was hungry," laying stress on every word and looking enigmatically but sincerely at her, "I should be happy now. You must believe that. What would it matter to you," he cried a moment later with a sort of despair, "what would it matter to you if I were to confess that I did wrong? What do you gain by such a stupid triumph over me? Ah, Sonia, was it for that I've come to you to day?" Again Sonia tried to say something but did not speak. End of Part 5, Chapter 4, Section 1. Recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine.